Hi, I'm Madhan. I'm a student at IIM Trichy. As a part of my Indian Economy and Policy final project, I'm here to talk about fiscal deficit. In India, the concept of fiscal deficit was introduced in the year 1991. Fiscal deficit occurs when the government's total expenditure exceeds its total revenue, excluding money from borrowings. These expenditures can be classified into current expenditures on goods and services for current use, capital expenditures on goods and services intended to create future benefits such as infrastructure investments, and finally, transfer payments that do not involve any transactions such as employment benefits, pensions, etc. The government revenues come from direct and indirect tax revenues and non-tax revenues. Now, how fiscal deficit can impact the economy depends on the nature of the deficit. On one hand, the Keynesian view supports that the fiscal deficit is good for the economy because it indicates large expenditures by the government. On the other hand, though, the Ricardian approach argues that it does not make any difference because the consumers would cut expenditures anticipating a higher tax that the government might impose in order to pay its borrowings. As the neoclassical economist would put it, increasing the government expenditures will negatively affect the savings and hence the economic growth. Let's discuss further. A country's private investment comes from its private and public savings, collectively known as domestic savings and current account. If there is a fiscal deficit, it affects the public savings negatively. This in turn eats up the domestic savings by levying tax, among other things, or it can impact the current account by borrowing money from abroad to fund its expenditures. And when this borrowings accumulates more and more, a balance of payment crisis occurs like it occurred in 1991. So the government has set certain limit on the allowable current account deficit as a percentage of GDP. So the next source for the government to repay its debt comes from the domestic borrowings. This the government could do by either imposing more tax or allowing private parties to take care of part of its public services. Either way, the savings of the domestic household gets affected. This, for a common man, means less savings and hence less consumption and hence a negative impact in the GDP. Next, the government can borrow from internal banks by selling government bonds. This in turn makes it difficult for the private entities to borrow owing to high interest rates, leading to crowding out of investments. So, with no active participation by the firms, there would be unemployment and the economic growth also slows down. This in turn again means lesser revenues for the government to fund its expenditures. Also, as the government's borrowings increase, the money supply in the economy would increase. This would lead to an imbalance in the demand and supply of the money in the economy, leading to inflation. But yes, fiscal deficit is good if it spurs economic growth. But how? When the government spends in infrastructure projects. In simple terms, fiscal deficit is good when the capital expenditures is a major part of fiscal deficit. The period to 1991 saw a large fiscal deficit and the balance of payment situation turning precarious and led to the introduction of new economic policy. Post 1991 period had the private sector share the burden of long-term development and contribute to capital expenditures in the form of disinvestments. And this combined with the tax reforms by the government had the fiscal deficit in control until 1996 to 97, the year when the Asian crisis pushed the fiscal deficit to unjustifiable levels in 2003. So, as a pragmatic solution to this problem, the FRVM Act of 2003 was introduced, which set out a phased reduction roadmap, and this put the Indian economy on the right track, however, was faced with a hiccup in the form of 2008 global credit crisis. India weathered the storm of the credit crisis well and then resumed the task of lowering the fiscal deficit through tax reforms and fiscal consolidation. And since then, the government has been more proactive, ensuring that the fiscal policy reforms were implemented effectively to ensure a steady reduction in fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, leading to a more resilient economy. In the last few years, if the fiscal deficit were maintained at 3% as per the FRBM Act's recommendation, India wouldn't have seen the growth that it saw. The primary deficit is projected to reach a near 0% from the current 40 basis points by the year 2021. If that happens and the economic growth keeps happening with increase in capital expenditures, the fiscal deficit can be contained without disturbing the supply demand dynamics of the economy.